Huangdi, the legendary Yellow Emperor and reputed ancestor of the Zhou dynasty, the historical paradigm of concord and civilization, is said to have brought harmony from chaos, tamed the barbarians and wild beasts, cleared the forests and marshes, and invented the 5 harmonious sounds, not through an act of epic bloodshed, but through his superior virtue, by adapting and yielding to natural conditions and to the will of heaven. Confucianism henceforth repudiates as unworkable the idea of military solutions to human problems. Huangdi's most notable heir, we are told, was Di Yao, a gentleman who naturally and without effort embraced reverence, courteousness, and intelligence. Nevertheless, during his reign, the deluge, mythology's universal symbol of enemy, threatened to inundate the land. Thus it fell upon him to appoint a successor to preserve the order of his own son. Di Yao chose the most qualified man for the job, the venerable Shun, who had in various tests already demonstrated a capacity to harmonize human affairs through righteousness. Shun, in turn, selected Yu the sage to engineer an end to the flood. Because Yu refused wine and always acted appropriately, moving with and not resisting nature, the way of heaven, Tian Dao, was revealed to him. He subsequently harnessed the river waters not by fighting against them with a dam, but by yielding to them and clearing for them a wider channel within which to run. Were it not for you, so the story goes, who herein personified the wisdom of both Confucius and Lao Tzu, the Taoist prophet, we would all be fish. From The Roman Way by Edith Hamilton. The devotion of his soldiers to him, affirmed in many stories, must be a fact. Julius Caesar could not have done what he did without it. The speech, in which it is always said he quelled a mutiny with a single word, calling his men not fellow soldiers as was his custom, but citizens, civilians, shows a great deal more about his methods than the mere clever use of a term. It was a most critical moment for him. He was in Rome after Pompey's defeat, on the point of sailing for Africa to put down the powerful senatorial army there. In the city, he was surrounded by bitter enemies. His whole dependence was his army, and the best and most trusted legion in it mutinied. They nearly killed their officer. They marched to Rome and claimed their discharge. They would serve Caesar no longer. He sent for them, telling them to bring their swords with them, a direction perfectly characteristic of him. Everything told of him shows his unconcern about danger to himself. Face to face with them, he asked them to state their case, and listened while they told him all they had done and suffered and been poorly rewarded for, and demanded to be discharged. His speech in answer was also characteristic, very gentle, very brief, exactly to the point. You say well, citizens. You have worked hard. You have suffered much. You desire your discharge. You have it. I discharge you all. You shall have your recompense. It shall never be said of me that I made use of you when I was in danger, and was ungrateful to you when danger was past. That was all. Yet the legionaries listening were completely broken to his will. They cried out that they would never leave him. They implored him to forgive them, to receive them again as his soldiers. Back of the words was his personality, and although that can never be recaptured, something of it yet comes through the brief, bald sentences. The strength that faced tranquilly desertion at a moment of great need. The pride that would not utter a word of appeal or reproach. The mild tolerance of one who knew men and counted upon nothing from them. From the I Ching. At times, one has to deal with hidden enemies, intangible influences that slink into dark corners, and from this hiding affect people by suggestion. In instances like this, it is necessary to trace these things back to the most secret recesses in order to determine the nature of the influences to be dealt with. The very anonymity of such plotting requires an especially vigorous and indefatigable effort, but this is well worthwhile. For when such elusive influences are brought into the light and branded, they lose their power over people. By Queen Elizabeth I. In those days, force and arms did prevail. But now the wit of the fox is everywhere on foot, so hardly a faithful or virtuous man may be found. From Julius Caesar, by J.F.C. Fuller. In this postscript on the solution of Caesar's problem, it is not our intention to trace Octavian's rise to power from the time he arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance until, in 31 BC, with the aid of Vipsanius Agrippa, he defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium and became master of the Roman world. Instead, it is to describe in brief how, as such, he solved Caesar's problem and established a peace which was to last for over 200 years. When he contemplated the empire he had won, and its heterogeneous local governments and peoples, he realized that it was far too large and complex to be ruled by the council of a city-state, that instead it demanded some form of one-man rule, and that his problem was how to disguise it. From the outset, he decided not to tamper with the constitution of the Republic or contemplate monarchy. Firstly, in 28 BC, he declined all honors calculated to remind the Romans of the kingly power, adopted the title of princeps, first citizen, and called his system the Principate. Secondly, he accepted all the old conventions, consuls, tribunes, magistrates, elections, etc. Thirdly, instead of ignoring the Senate and insulting its members as Caesar had done, he went out of his way to consult it and placate them. Lastly, on January 13th, 27 BC, at a session of the Senate, he renounced all his extraordinary powers and placed them at the disposal of the Senate and the people. And when the senators begged him to resume them and not to abandon the commonwealth he had saved, he yielded to their request and consented to assume proconsular authority over an enlarged province which included Spain, Gaul, Syria, Cilicia, and Cyprus, while the Senate was left with the remaining provinces. Thus, in semblance, the sovereignty of the Senate and the people was restored. But in fact, because his enlarged province comprised the majority of the legions and Egypt, over which he ruled as king, the basis of political power passed into his hands. 3 days later, the Senate decreed that the title Augustus, the revered, should be conferred upon him. From the Book of Psalms. It is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smoother than butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. From The Wiles of War. The idiom represents an archetype in world literature, a person with a smiling face and a cruel heart, dubbed a smiling tiger in Chinese folklore. And lastly, from Strategies of Psychotherapy by J. Haley. It is not pathological to attempt to gain control of a relationship. We all do this. But when one attempts to gain that control while denying it, then such a person is exhibiting symptomatic behavior. In any relationship that stabilizes, such as that between a husband and wife, the two people work out agreements about who is to control what area of the relationship. A relationship becomes psychopathological when one of the two people will maneuver to circumscribe the other's behavior, while indicating he is not. The wife in such a relationship will